The facade of Montecito is fracturing quite spectacularly as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex frantically turn to a fatigued Netflix to salvage a public image that has hit an unprecedented rock bottom, all while yet another communications chief abandons ship and a gravely ill father lies fighting for his life in a hospital bed half a world away. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this rather extraordinary development. To truly understand the sheer panic currently gripping the Sussex household, one must look past the glossy, highly filtered press releases and examine the frantic paddling beneath the surface of their curated Californian existence. We are witnessing the heavy psychological burden of a couple who are slowly and painfully realizing that their carefully constructed narrative of perpetual victimhood has definitively expired in the eyes of the global public. The atmosphere within their sprawling, sun-drenched estate must be incredibly suffocating right now, entirely devoid of the triumphant vindication they undoubtedly expected when they first walked away from the historic stability of the royal institution. Instead of cementing themselves as universally adored humanitarian leaders, they are finding that the world is growing remarkably weary of their relentless self-promotion, leaving them isolated in a remarkably expensive echo chamber of their own making. One can almost picture the tense, humorless strategy meetings taking place over organic lattes, as the stark realization sets in that the Hollywood elite are no longer returning their calls with the same fervent enthusiasm they once did. The long-term consequences of this public fatigue are devastating for their brand, as it becomes glaringly obvious that one cannot sustainably market oneself as a paragon of universal compassion while actively demanding preferential treatment from corporate streaming giants who are fast losing their patience. This profound disconnect between their projected image and their actual reality is nowhere more evident than in the absolute chaos of their professional management, highlighted by the recent and rather embarrassing departure of yet another senior public relations executive. It is quite simply staggering to comprehend that Meghan and Prince Harry are now reportedly on their 11th or 12th PR team member in the space of just 5 years, a revolving door of highly paid staff that speaks absolute volumes about the fraught internal dynamics of their operation. A well-meaning staff member recently indicated that the chaotic management style behind the gates is driven by a constant, exhausting tension between attempting to ruthlessly control every microscopic media narrative and the harsh reality of their dwindling public appeal. One cannot help but wonder how a couple expects to manage a global, multi-million-dollar public image when they seemingly cannot even manage to retain a cohesive internal team for more than a few fiscal quarters without someone running for the exit. The inner monologue of these departing executives must be a fascinating mix of profound professional relief and utter bewilderment, having likely realized that no amount of strategic crisis communication can fix a brand that is fundamentally at odds with its own actions and entirely resistant to constructive criticism. This unprecedented rate of corporate attrition permanently erodes their standing within elite Hollywood circles, as top-tier talent will inevitably refuse to board a sinking ship where the captains are entirely unwilling to accept any responsibility for the structural damage they themselves have caused. If you cannot maintain the loyalty and confidence of the very people paid handsomely to protect and elevate your reputation, the long-term consequence is a slow but entirely inevitable descent into professional irrelevance, leaving them completely unequipped to handle the very real crises that continue to mount on their doorstep. Perhaps the most damaging crisis of all, and certainly the one that most sharply exposes the vast chasm between the Duchess's public preaching and her private practice, is the tragic situation currently unfolding with her father, Thomas Markle. While the elderly man recently underwent major life-altering emergency surgery, reportedly resulting in a devastating leg amputation, halfway across the world in a hospital in the Philippines, his daughter appears to be continuing her leisurely lifestyle, supposedly sipping tea and maintaining her serene routine within the luxurious confines of her Montecito mansion. There is a stark, almost chilling contrast between the grave, terrifying reality of a sterile intensive care unit where a father is literally fighting for his life and the peaceful, hyper-curated serenity of Meghan's Californian existence, complete with its private security and manicured lawns. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain such a profound and stubborn detachment from one's own flesh and blood, especially during a moment of such acute medical vulnerability, are quite difficult for the average empathetic person to logically comprehend. Her inner monologue must surely be an impenetrable fortress of relentless self-justification, a highly necessary psychological defense mechanism to block out the uncomfortable reality that her highly publicized campaign for global kindness does not seem to extend to the man who funded her private education and raised her. The atmosphere surrounding this deeply personal family drama is heavy with a sense of irrevocable tragedy, as the public watches a daughter seemingly prioritize her bruised ego, past grievances, and brand aesthetics over basic familial duty and fundamental human decency. The long-term consequence of this glaring hypocrisy is the absolute destruction of any lingering public goodwill, because the audience ultimately judges a public figure not by the grand philanthropic speeches they deliver to adoring crowds, but by how they treat those who are weak, vulnerable, and inextricably linked to their own history. This extraordinary lack of self-awareness and familial duty has certainly not gone unnoticed across the pond, where the contrast between lifelong public service and fleeting self-interest is measured with a rather different and much harsher yardstick. Someone close to palace circles recently noted the quiet, dignified astonishment echoing through the royal establishment over her utter detachment from her father's dire medical situation, viewing it as a sad but entirely predictable confirmation of the institutional concerns they held from the very beginning of the marriage. The British public, deeply rooted in traditions of stoicism and unyielding familial loyalty, finds it entirely baffling that Prince Harry, a man who has spent the last several years publicly demanding apologies and emotional accountability from his own relatives, can stand silently by as his wife exhibits such profound indifference toward hers. The unspoken internal pressure on Harry must be immense. One has to imagine the jarring cognitive dissonance occurring within his own mind as he watches the woman he upended his entire royal life for demonstrate a staggering lack of the very compassion they routinely accuse the royal family of lacking. The atmosphere within the wider societal discourse has definitively shifted from a state of sympathetic curiosity to one of cold, cynical dismissal, as viewers and commentators alike collectively realize that the Sussex brand is built on a foundation of profound and unresolvable contradictions. As the years progress and the glossy, highly produced veneer continues to peel away under the harsh light of reality, the long-term consequence is that Meghan and Harry will find themselves entirely devoid of the one currency that truly matters in long-term public life: genuine authenticity. They are discovering much too late that you cannot continuously demand the world's empathy when your own well of grace appears so shockingly dry, leaving them to navigate a highly isolated, self-inflicted exile where the silence of their former supporters is far more damning than the loudest of their critics. As we pivot our gaze from the shambolic state of their personal public relations to the rather unforgiving, cold reality of the corporate boardroom, it becomes increasingly apparent that the tolerance of Netflix executives has been stretched to its absolute breaking limit. The streaming giant, which once heralded the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex with multi-million-dollar fanfare and breathless press releases, now finds itself entirely weary of the couple's constant, increasingly desperate requests for an institutional bailout, as nearly every single project they touch inexplicably flops. One can almost feel the icy, palpable sense of a major corporate entity strategically and ruthlessly distancing itself from a toxic asset, as the halls of Netflix headquarters echo not with excitement over upcoming lifestyle content, but with the heavy collective sighs of executives who deeply regret tying their professional reputations to such an unpredictable duo. The inner monologue of these Hollywood power players must be a chaotic mix of sheer, red-faced embarrassment and quiet fury, having realized too late that they invested an astronomical fortune in a brand that is chronically incapable of delivering anything beyond past familial grievances and tedious, self-indulgent reflection. The atmosphere in those high-level strategy meetings has undoubtedly shifted from eager collaboration to tense, defensive damage control, as the grim realization sets in that the Sussexes simply do not possess the creative acumen or the rigorous work ethic required to sustain a lucrative entertainment empire. The long-term consequence of this profound corporate fatigue is an unmitigated disaster for Meghan and Harry's financial future, as the undeniable failure to secure their footing within the streaming industry means they are rapidly burning through the very bridges they desperately need to survive in the fiercely competitive landscape of American media. The sheer indignity of the situation is perhaps best encapsulated by the farcical saga of her heavily promoted artisan jams and marmalades, products that were meant to herald her triumphant return to the digital sphere, but have instead become a rather cruel, running corporate joke. It is profoundly humiliating to consider that highly paid Netflix employees are now reportedly being handed unwanted jars of this fruit preserve for free. A desperate, transparent attempt to clear out depreciating inventory that has morphed into a glaring symbol of the couple's precipitously declining cultural cachet. The quiet, relentless snickering among corporate staff members over this forced distribution highlights the total collapse of the Sussex brand's prestige, as the very people tasked with promoting their content are now openly mocking their secondary commercial ventures in the break room. In fact, the whispers surrounding the quality of this bespoke preserve have reached such an absurd crescendo that the same source behind closed doors wryly suggested her marmalade is so remarkably dreadful it could theoretically be used as a form of torture to extract classified information. Imagine, if you will, the profound cognitive dissonance of attempting to market oneself as a paragon of refined, elevated living, while simultaneously producing a culinary item that the general public and corporate allies alike find entirely unpalatable, if not downright offensive to the senses. The long-term consequence of this culinary catastrophe is the inescapable realization that even the most aggressive, well-funded marketing campaigns cannot save a brand that fundamentally lacks substance, leaving the Duchess to preside over a phantom lifestyle empire that generates nothing but widespread ridicule and rapidly expiring inventory. When one steps back to view the totality of this catastrophic commercial unraveling, it becomes painstakingly clear that the Montecito venture is fundamentally collapsing under the immense, unsustainable weight of its own unearned arrogance and staggering lack of execution. To boldly launch an upscale lifestyle brand while wielding a royal title, only to fail spectacularly at the basic mechanics of selling edible jam and functional candles, is a public humiliation from which it is nearly impossible to intellectually or commercially recover. The suffocating pressure on Prince Harry must be mounting exponentially behind the scenes as he watches the primary vehicle for their future financial independence devolve into a cautionary tale of hubris, leaving them entirely reliant on a dwindling pool of goodwill that they have already thoroughly exhausted. Their collective inner monologue must be fraught with a dawning, terrifying panic as they stare down the barrel of an incredibly expensive Californian lifestyle, complete with exorbitant security costs and massive mortgage payments, without the safety net of the lucrative corporate partnerships they so carelessly squandered. The atmosphere surrounding their professional endeavors is now permanently tainted with the unmistakable stench of failure, a repellent that guarantees future investors and streaming platforms will run entirely in the opposite direction, rather than risk associating their capital with such a proven, disastrous liability. Ultimately, the long-term consequence of this protracted corporate farce is the total and absolute flatlining of their brand equity, cementing their tragic legacy not as the progressive global leaders they so desperately wish to be, but as a deeply flawed, utterly out-of-touch couple who somehow managed to trade the historic majesty of the British monarchy for a dusty warehouse filled to the brim with wickless candles and unwanted marmalade. The cultural atmosphere in America has undergone a rather spectacular and unforgiving shift, violently transforming the Duke and Duchess of Sussex from revered, universally sympathized victims of an ancient institution into the unfortunate punchlines of mainstream entertainment's broader, increasingly cynical conversation. The defining, arguably most surreal moment of this cultural pivot recently arrived from a remarkably unexpected corner of the celebrity ecosystem, as the global pop phenomenon Nicki Minaj publicly and rather bluntly advised Prince Harry that it was high time to phone home like E.T. and seriously reassess the disastrous trajectory of his post-royal life. It is a profoundly bizarre yet highly poignant intervention that perfectly encapsulates the collective heavy exhaustion of an American public that initially welcomed the couple with open protective arms, only to grow incredibly fatigued by their relentless, highly lucrative airing of private family grievances on global television. For a man who famously abandoned the gray skies of his homeland under the grand, sweeping guise of finding personal freedom and progressive enlightenment, the jarring cognitive dissonance of hearing a prominent American celebrity casually tell him what the British public has known all along must be entirely staggering. One has to imagine that his internal monologue is currently trapped in a strange, profound state of psychological denial, desperately clinging to the increasingly fragile, transparent illusion that his crusade against his own flesh and blood was a righteous endeavor rather than a deeply flawed, highly destructive public relations strategy. The realization that the Hollywood elite are no longer blindly supportive, but are instead openly viewing him as a deeply tragic cautionary tale of overexposure and misplaced hubris brings a creeping cold isolation that no amount of Californian sunshine can possibly warm. This cold, suffocating isolation is the inevitable byproduct of a strategy built entirely on the commodification of familial trauma, a choice that has ultimately alienated the very demographic they so desperately sought to impress and cultivate within the notoriously fickle American entertainment industry. A longtime family acquaintance recently expressed profound, quiet sorrow over Harry's staggering lack of self-awareness, noting that the sheer tragedy of his self-inflicted exile lies in his absolute inability to comprehend that publicly monetizing his family's dirty laundry was the precise act that destroyed his long-term credibility. It is incredibly difficult for the average rational observer to imagine the sheer level of hubris required to believe that one could viciously trash a deeply respected, globally recognized institution for millions of dollars and still be universally embraced by an industry that quietly values loyalty, supreme discretion, and bankable, uncomplicated success. The public reckoning over this disastrous calculation is now playing out in agonizing real time as the couple collectively discovers that the lucrative contracts, the A-list party invitations, and the uncritical media adoration they once took entirely for granted are rapidly evaporating into thin air. They are instead being replaced by unsolicited, highly public lectures from pop stars and cultural commentators who correctly point out that family matters should remain private, and that there is a distinct, unbridgeable difference between speaking one's truth and engaging in a prolonged, profitable smear campaign against one's own relatives. Harry appears entirely paralyzed by this stark realization, seemingly unable to chart a viable path forward because the very foundation of his carefully crafted post-royal identity, the aggrieved, emotionally liberated, exiled prince, has completely lost its cultural currency and its once lucrative commercial appeal. Ultimately, when major pop culture figures with massive global platforms feel entirely comfortable publicly advising a British prince to swallow his pride, apologize for his transgressions, and quietly return to his roots, the transatlantic public relations battle is irrevocably and definitively lost. The cementing of their status as Hollywood pariahs is a devastating long-term consequence of their own relentless, unyielding self-sabotage, as they have systematically alienated the British public, entirely exasperated their corporate partners, and finally exhausted the seemingly infinite patience of the American entertainment industry. There is simply no magical public relations spin, no highly paid, newly hired communications director, and no multi-million-dollar philanthropic rebrand that can possibly undo the catastrophic, self-inflicted damage of the last few years, because the general public has fundamentally and permanently lost trust in the authenticity of their ever-shifting narrative. As they sit in their sprawling, heavily guarded Montecito estate, surrounded by the physical trappings of immense, unimaginable wealth but entirely devoid of the institutional protection, familial warmth, and genuine global respect they once enjoyed, the silence from their former Hollywood allies must be absolutely deafening. They have foolishly traded a historic, unshakable legacy of global public service and unparalleled duty for a fleeting, highly destructive, and ultimately hollow moment in the tabloid sun, leaving them to navigate the bitter consequences of their actions. As the dust finally settles on their spectacular American experiment, they are left with absolutely nothing but the harsh, unforgiving reality of a deeply lonely, remarkably expensive, and entirely self-inflicted exile from which there appears to be no easy or dignified return. For Prince Harry, the dawning, incredibly heavy realization that the bridge back to his homeland is not merely damaged, but burned to an absolute, unsalvageable crisp, must be an exceptionally bitter pill to swallow in the quiet, isolated hours of the night. It is one thing to boldly declare one's independence and air deeply personal family grievances in the heat of a highly lucrative American television interview, but it is entirely another to wake up years later and realize that the British public, a populace once deeply and inherently devoted to his well-being, will absolutely never welcome him back with the open, forgiving arms he undoubtedly expected. A well-placed source recently indicated that there is an absolute, unwavering refusal within the highest echelons of the British establishment to ever entertain a meaningful return to the fold, as the profound, calculated damage inflicted upon the monarchy's dignity during the highly vulnerable final years of the late Queen's life is considered entirely unforgivable. He is fundamentally trapped in a gilded Californian cage of his own incredibly short-sighted design, agonizingly cut off from the historic legacy, the lifelong military patronages, and the deeply rooted cultural identity that once gave his complicated, privileged life genuine purpose and universal respect. The tragic irony is that in his desperate, highly monetized pursuit of supposed emotional freedom, he has voluntarily exiled himself to a remarkably shallow environment where loyalty is strictly transactional, friendships are based on utility, and family is viewed merely as highly exploitable content for the next streaming cycle. The long-term consequence of this betrayal is a permanent state of geographic and emotional limbo, rendering him a man without a true country or a defined, respectable role, perpetually haunted by the ghosts of a majestic past that he carelessly traded away for a fleeting, ultimately hollow moment of Hollywood notoriety. This profound sense of aimlessness has inevitably cultivated a gloomy, quiet desperation that is now heavily settling over the sprawling Montecito estate, a once bustling hub of grand ambition that is rapidly transforming into a rather expensive, deeply isolated fortress. As the high-profile gala invitations begin to visibly dry up and the incessant ringing of the proverbial Hollywood phone slows to an agonizing, undeniable crawl, the uncomfortable chatter surrounding the couple's private, day-to-day reality has grown increasingly loud and highly concerning. A source within the inner circle has pointedly highlighted the intense friction and deeply unsettling coping mechanisms developing behind closed doors, specifically referencing the uncomfortable growing whispers regarding Harry's alleged increasing reliance on various substances to artificially numb the harsh, unyielding reality of his spectacular fall from grace. It is a profoundly tragic tableau to carefully consider. A once beloved prince sitting in a heavily guarded multi-million-dollar mansion, entirely cut off from the trusted, discreet confidants of his youth, allegedly seeking chemical solace to manage the suffocating weight of being inextricably trapped in a life built entirely on past grievances and unfulfilled, grandiose promises. His inner monologue must be a relentless, agonizing loop of second-guessing and profound regret, battling the terrifying realization that the woman for whom he sacrificed his entire royal inheritance has confidently led them into a commercial and social cul-de-sac from which there is simply no dignified exit strategy. The atmosphere within the home must be incredibly tense, an exhausting, deeply paranoid environment where the frantic, desperate plotting of the next ill-fated public relations rebrand collides violently with the depressing, inescapable truth that their cultural cachet has thoroughly and permanently evaporated under the Californian sun. Ultimately, we are witnessing the final, unavoidable reckoning of a spectacularly ill-conceived American experiment, a devastating public collapse that serves as a definitive masterclass in the absolute dangers of unearned hubris, lack of talent, and catastrophic media overexposure. They are now facing a terrifyingly permanent Hollywood exile, heavily burdened with exorbitant private security costs, massive estate mortgages, and a terrifyingly rapid depletion of the vast unearned funds they accumulated during their initial grievance-fueled media blitz across the major streaming platforms. The sheer tragic farce of this entire endeavor is perhaps best summarized by the deeply embarrassing, leaked reality of their current commercial output. They arrogantly walked away from the profound, unshakable majesty of a 1,000-year-old institution, only to find themselves desperately attempting to peddle a dusty warehouse full of defective, wickless candles and universally mocked, unwanted marmalade. It is a spectacular, almost Shakespearean fall from grace that will undoubtedly be studied by public relations professionals for decades to come, proving once and for all that a royal title violently stripped of public duty, personal dignity, and fundamental familial loyalty is essentially worthless in the unforgiving, results-driven arena of global public opinion. They have thoroughly exhausted the inherent goodwill of the British public, entirely alienated the American entertainment industry, and spectacularly squandered their once-in-a-lifetime global platform, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the deeply uncomfortable, remarkably expensive bed they have so meticulously made for themselves. I would be fascinated to hear your considered thoughts on this unparalleled unraveling. So would you like me to compile a summary of the most prominent viewer reactions to these revelations for our next discussion?